Welcome to the Infill Podcast, where we interview the most interesting members of the 3D printing and maker communities, live and with audience participation. And now, here is your host, Jonathan Levy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Let me see if I can get my video working, because of course, Murphy's Law, as we get up and running, there will always be something causing issues. Really excited to have everybody here. We have an amazing guest for you, as usual, this week. I am joined by no other than Guy Naim. He is a researcher and master's candidate at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who is researching, get this, advanced polymers for 3D printing. He has already published some work for resin 3D printing that's at the very cutting edge, and he has promised to share with me everything that he can, because not everything has been published or published. Yeah, I think that's the word. With his research about FDM 3D printing. He is joining me from Jerusalem, and I'm in Tel Aviv. Guy, welcome to the show. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and for those in the audience who are already commenting, yes, I had a very chaotic bedtime ritual with my two sons, who I had exclusively all to myself, so there was no time to grab a beanie, and you guys are getting to see the lion hair. Here, Guy, I tried to do my best with your bio, but as with all interesting people, it was hard to do it justice. Can you fill in the blanks where I kind of left some blanks there, and kind of explain in your terms what it is you do and what it is specifically that you're researching?
Well, unlike some of your other guests that have decades or more of being 3D printers and working about it, I'm only about 2 years into my research and to my work about it. It is my 5th year studying here in the Hebrew University, and only 2 years ago I started projects that have anything to do with 3D printing and with polymers in general. So about 2 years ago, more or less, I joined the group that I'm in now, Professor Mendel's group, and I was assigned a project that has to do with resins and with 3D printing and everything in between, mainly trying to create a new resin for DLP 3D printers that can carry with it certain materials into the body if you want to use it for medical purposes, or simply for many other options, with a specificity on nanoparticles and nanomaterials and what we can do with them.
Mm-hmm.
For everyone who's not familiar with nanoparticles and what that means and what all nanoscience means nowadays, it's not the same magic and technology that we can see in the movies. It's more about the fact that once you play with the sizes of whatever it is you want to use, you get some different criteria and some different attributes to whatever it is you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, by changing the size from small crystals and to hundreds or dozens of nanometers, you can get some very interesting results. For example, if you take zinc oxide, the same thing that we use on sunscreen
Right.
when one of us gets burned, to avoid getting burned, and you play a bit with the shape and the sizes to make it more rod-like, you can play with it so that once you shine certain UV lights on it, it's going to start radical polymerization, so it can even be the initiator for resin polymers, which I hope is not too scientific for the audience right now.
The way I'm understanding what you're saying is you're controlling which spectrums of light it's going to interact with.
Yeah, you can play around with that. You can play
Right.
around with some of the other aspects of it. For example, once you play around enough with the size and the shape of zinc oxide, it's the same material that I also use, you get antibacterial effect when it doesn't just kill some bacteria but it eradicates them.
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean by that is, if you put antibiotics into the body, if let's say I try to create an implant and I add antibiotics to this implant, it's going to leach out and kill whatever bacteria are going to try to attack the implant and everything around it. So by adding this antibiotic, it's going to release and to kill the bacteria. However, some bacteria might be resistant to it, and once you just kill the bacteria, you might get a film of dead bacteria, and bacteria can grow on dead bacteria. So you can also find that by trying to kill bacteria from a specific direction, you kind of lose what you try to do. Zinc oxide, on the other hand, eliminates bacteria in a way more complex way that we as scientists still don't fully understand and fully identify it by now. There are a few options, and it's probably something to do with that and that, or so on, some combination of them. But basically, the full destruction we see of the bacteria when we use it, make it so you don't get a film of that bacteria, and you can keep on working with that. And I played around and managed to create a new resin for DLP printers that maybe one day will be actually used for implants after being proved to work perfectly for the human body, that you won't need to add antibiotics after. So from the printer straight to the body, and only after removing the supports.
Wow, that's really incredible. No post-processing necessary to actually get it in the body. Tell me about, I think in your email you had said that you recently kind of made the move in after, having some achievements in resin, you made the move to FDM. And when I think of FDM, FDM 3D printer behind you, when I think of FDM, the first thing that jumps out at me is like not food safe, not safe in the body because of all the layer lines and stuff like that. Are you also doing implantable stuff in FDM, or you've moved away from the medical for that?
You can actually create medical application, including implants, that are FDM printed.
Really?
Yes, what you say is correct. The very fact that we make those layers, we have a lot of crevices and a lot of small spaces that bacteria can grow in or be attached to.
Right.
And through that, if we all know that if we're trying to create a plate by DLP printing, by FDM printing,
Right.
it's going to grow many bacteria on it, and it's going to be very unsafe for us. But once you manage to do it so it can kill the bacteria in a better way, you actually can work with that, or you can use the same technology to then create things that might not go into the body, but thanks to the fact that they're antibacterial or have any other purposes to them, might play around with other things and work in different ways. For example, if you want to do something you want to print some things that you're going to place in a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And there are already antibacterial filaments available for purchase.
Oh, that's interesting. I never knew that.
So there are, and the way they make most of them, or I think even all of them, is by simply adding antibacterial material to the pellets before even extruding it to a filament.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. That's really interesting. So I didn't realize that. So is that the work that you're doing when you work with FDM? You're also working on implantable filaments?
So while we can implant many of the things that I'm trying to work on, right now I'm working on a new method, a new way to add materials to filaments. For example, this is why you see semi-empty filaments behind me. Those are filaments that I treated and I worked with and printed most of them, and now have some left over to see if I need to make some adjustment or to create something more, or to simply check the filament to see if any problem occurred with it before the printing. But basically, when you play around with filaments like this, there are a few ways that you can approach treating them. The most common one is to go all the way back to when you have pellets before even ever extruding it, and adding things to it. For example, I believe this is how they make most of those wood PLA filaments.
Right.
And there are also a few other ways that are not very common but are very interesting, that use the fact that PLA, for example, is hygroscopic, so you can attach things to it if they behave anything like water.
Uh-huh.
A very interesting way that people approached it and worked about adding antibiotics to PLA to later learn about whether or not we can use it for certain medical purposes, was by dissolving the antibiotic in ethanol and then putting the PLA in the ethanol overnight, shaking, sometimes even with certain heating purposes. So it just gets, the antibiotic gets absorbed into the PLA, and
Hmm.
then they were able to print with it and see how fast the antibiotics is leaching out of it. Because
Okay.
if you can create antibiotics, an implant with antibiotics that leaches out over a long period of time, you don't need to give the patient antibiotic for a long period of time.
So you could literally implant, for example, an artificial, I don't know, heart stent or something that's 3D printed, which literally includes the antibiotics, and there's no risk of the patient forgetting to take their antibiotics that they would need to take if taking a heart stent.
Yeah, and not only that, once you take antibiotic in regular ways, for example, by taking a pill or even by injecting it, you need to take such a dose that will fit your entire body, let's say, because it's going to travel through your entire body. If you put
Right.
it on the medical things that you implanted and it gets released there, you can use such a small dosage that
Right.
you avoid so many of the after effects or the side effects that you might see from antibiotics.
Yeah, I mean, so my last podcast was in health, obviously, and I talked to a number of gut microbiome experts, and we're discovering that the microbiome is the next frontier, like the genome was 10 or 20 years ago, and we're learning that so much of not even just our general health, but our psychology, our physiology, so much of our body, and this is me getting a little too sciencey, but so much of like even our behavior comes down to microbiome. And if you look at children who have attention deficit, you can see markers in their microbiome, and it's what we're eating, and it's the food that our body wants and craves because of our microbiome. And one of the best ways to destroy your microbiome is general antibiotics, right? Like I get a small dental implant. I have to have what's it called, ashtala, in Hebrew the word, but you
Yeah,
have to have
to
an implant.
implant them, to surgically insert it.
Yeah, a
Insert.
surgical implant here in this small area, and I need to, dose my entire body with antibiotics. It's not great. It's kind of like burning down an entire forest because you want to kill one specific rat. So
Yeah,
that's
this is
really
pretty much how
interesting.
it works many times.
That is very, very interesting. What kind of applications? I mean, I threw out heart stint. What kind of applications are in practice today actually being 3D printed and putting in the body, or is this all theoretical of what we
So
could 3D print?
one of the great advantages of 3D printing is, of course, the fact that you can customize everything that you create.
Right.
So let's say you break your leg in a way that part of the bone needs to be replaced. You can use CT scanning in order to figure out exactly how broken your leg is and what exactly are the parts there, and
Right.
to print whatever it is the implant they're going to put into your body before you ever get your anesthesia and start being prepared
Amazing.
to go on the hospital bed for the operation theater.
Amazing. That's amazing. But in terms of what's actually being done today, are there any? I mean, I've seen like at trade shows and stuff like that, but I'm
So
I'm unclear
yeah.
on what's actually going into people's bodies today. Is there stuff that's being 3D printed and being implanted in the body today outside of just experimentation?
So yes, there is.
Wow.
Um, Telling you exactly what is because I read so much. At some point, I start getting confused about what I only read as theoretical and what I read about actually being used.
Sure.
But for example, one of the things that is being used and is showing great promise, and that I'm very much hoping to research about it further on in my studies, probably during my PhD or postdoc or whatever.
Hmm.
It's about PEEK, polyether ketone.
Yeah.
It is a filament that not many people know about because not everyone can print. To actually get an FDM printer to print it, you either need to get top-notch printers that can reach the temperature because the printing temperature is over 400 degrees Celsius.
Right.
And the bed also needs to be, if I remember correctly, like 130 or something like that.
Right.
So it is very interesting because it is about as strong as our strongest bones, and we can play around with how strong it is by playing with how much infill we put and how the perimeter is going to look, which
Right.
is also incredibly important, and it's one of the harder things to understand when we speak about implants. Let's say I need to switch out one of the major bones in your legs, and I'm going to pick something that is a lot sturdier than bone. You're not going to be able to walk straight too much. Your body is going to naturally lean toward one leg more than another because it feels how the two are stretched and how the two
Sure.
are compressed. And over time, you're going to get bad posture and create many problems regarding that. So the very fact that you can tune everything in the printer and to reach the specific levels you need when it comes to stress and mechanical properties is also incredible.
Wow. I never even thought about it. You just blew my mind a little bit. I never even thought about just replacing an entire bone, which it sounds like, I mean, I have, you can see, for those of you listening, like I have specific segments of my finger which didn't heal well, right? And maybe finger is an extreme case. You probably wouldn't want to replace that. But there are parts of people's bones, for example, your kneecap, right, which you can break and it can take years to heal properly because it's a joint that you're using. You could theoretically, I mean, in a futuristic scenario, just replace that bone.
Yes, this is what
Wow.
I believe that we are moving toward, and I believe this is going to be some of
Well,
the not so fiction science we're going to see when time
that's
moves
pretty
on.
wild. I guess my concern would be, the connections and all the tendons and like bones are pretty well connected and integrated. So I think it's going to be hard. Like, for example, if an old lady breaks their hip to switch out, the joint. But maybe I think one interesting area that immediately pops to mind for me is like, how do you fuse artificial bone to regular bone? So, right, if there's a piece of the hip that's shattered, can we print that piece in peak and weld it to the existing part of the bone?
So considering the fact that they managed to do it with certain parts, especially from the skull, for example, I remember I read about not too long ago. So yes, especially if you use the correct nanoparticles. The way the bone looks in the way that hydroxyapatite nanoparticles are synthesized in the lab are, are fitting so well together that by adding them to whatever it is you print through whatever method you find that manages to do it correctly, you can make the bone integrate to it and grow onto it and be accepted to it so it feels like it's part of it.
That's really crazy. And it's also really crazy because I think when we think of peak, we think of this like flame resistant, super artificial material. I didn't realize that it could possibly be safe in the body. I know TPU is safe in the body. I have a lot of questions already. I was worried I wouldn't have enough questions because sometimes, like, if I don't understand a topic enough, which I clearly don't understand polymer science, I'm like, it's over my head. But I have so many questions. The first is like, so the workflow would be something like, in your kind of ideal scenario, we get a patient, we see shattered bone, we maybe extract that from the body, piece it together to see what it looked like, 3D scan it even to save
You
time.
can scan it without removing it from the body using
Oh, true.
CT or other scanning technologies.
Right. So, okay, we 3D scan it in the body. The patient's obviously in pain. We can reassemble that model and 3D print a replacement in a matter of hours because we're talking, I mean, not 100% infill, things like that, like you said. Wow, that's crazy. And then just implant it right into the body.
Someone asked in the chat about if we take crushed bone and we play around with
Saw
it, if
that.
it's going to catch better onto the body.
Yeah, that's a
I,
great question.
I actually haven't read any articles or any scientific papers that try to simply take bones, crush them, and use them. But because of the fact that the bone contains many things, but the main thing it contains is hydroxyapatite. It's calcium and phosphate and carbons and everything around it. So by picking and choosing them and by playing again with the sizes and the shapes of everything, because nanoscience is one of the major advantages and major roots and we found and we play around with it today in science, we can pinpoint and optimize it a lot better. And by creating it this way and very much controlling it, especially if we do it from bottom up, what we call it, when we start from the atoms and we create a nanoparticle.
Right.
We a lot of time have way better distribution of the sizes, and we can control it and use it a lot better later on.
So that's really interesting. And I assume if you're working with Peak, this must only be FDM.
I'm hoping to work with Peak in the future by
Oh,
either getting a printer that can do it or by modifying the Prusa I have behind me.
yeah.
Apparently, you can do it if you take the correct parts and you make it in the right way. Basically, you break down most of the things besides the skeleton of the Prusa and you
Right.
remake everything. You can make it a Peak printing printer.
That's interesting. So why the shift? I don't think we covered it. Why the shift from resin to FDM? I mean, what does FDM offer, especially in a medical context, that resin can't?
Okay, so I'm I wouldn't say that it definitely has major advantages against in regards to comparing it to the resins, but it is an also interesting thing. And after playing around with the DLP for a while, and I wanted to broaden my horizon and to learn to play with something else, and also had my idea of a new method of how you can modify filaments, and I really wanted to test it out.
Yeah.
And I think that I managed to I had a bit more luck than brains probably on that one, but I managed to find a system that works very nicely. And I managed in the same system by only switching around the nanoparticles of a few other parameters, create antibacterial filaments, mainly by adding zinc oxide. I managed to create hydrophobic filaments and hydrophobic prints by adding hydrophobic silica nanoparticles. I played
Right.
around with trying to add phosphates to see if I can make 3D prints that as it degrades, it's going to become even better become really good for the environment. That's simply going to, as it's released on the ground, to become food for plants. But
Yeah.
that didn't work as well. But I think need to still play around with it. Maybe in the
That's
future,
very
you're going
interesting.
to find a way to make your 3D prints become compost.
That's very interesting. And Zach Friedman just did a video recently about this filament. I mean, he did like all the cursed filaments, and one of them was made of algae. And if I'm remembering correctly, one of the reasons for that was that the plastic over time was water soluble, and the idea was this algae would dissolve and it would become substrate for growing coral, maybe, or maybe it was other kinds of algae and seaweed. But basically, like being able to 3D print, structures. And I know, I'm invested in a venture capital firm that's working on lab. I always forget the nice term, cultured meat, not lab meat, cultured meat. And that's one of the big difficult things, right? Is how do you create this structure for the meat to actually grow on? You need somehow to create a lattice, and 3D printing is really, really good at lattices, way more than traditional
Mhm.
manufacturing, injection molding, things like that. Where do you see, besides medical, kind of the big frontiers? I mean, we've made so we they researchers, polymer scientists, you all have made so many leaps and bounds just in the last 10 years with filaments and polymers, and the fact that we can all 3D print incredibly strong PLA, and PETG and all these wonderful things, whereas in the past it was like ABS and nylon if you were lucky. Where do you think are the frontiers that have not yet been conquered? Where do you look at filament today that's available commercially and you say, like, God, there's got to be a better way to do this?
So actually, from everything you said, I can take it to two very interesting directions. One of them is going to how we can take PLA, even simple PLA, and play with it to make it a lot sturdier and a lot stronger. And the
Really?
second, if we work and we actually speak about the future and the incredibly interesting things that we can see of it and things that have already start being in even almost applicable by now, I can speak about 4D printing and what's that
Right.
mean for the continuation and why is 3D printing in FDM is so proper for it.
Tell me more.
So let's start with one of with two articles that I read about how they took something they took a printer with the regular printer and one of the men played around with the printer to make the PLA prints be a lot sturdier,
Right.
and the other played around in another very interesting way to modify the PLA before the printing to make it stronger still. So one of them simply went to the 3D printer, went to the nozzle, and he added here, just next to it, another small and crucial part, which was basically a steam roller. And he programmed it and wrote a very nice article about it, a very nice scientific article. So after every layer, it simply steamrolls that layer down into the other one,
No kidding.
making it a lot sturdier and reaching the same result of mechanical result as if you only take one line of PLA and start playing with it like that.
Huh. That sounds like something that Stefan at CNC Kitchen would do a video about. Stefan, if you're listening.
Maybe you
That,
will, yeah. And the
that
other one, something very interesting that I've seen from a university in Texas, if I remember correctly. He did something that was actually his idea for a method is not that far from mine. I do believe that mine is a bit better because of certain aspects of it that again I'm not going to share with you today.
sure.
But what he did, he dissolved PLA in some sort of an organic solvent, and then he added some more material, specifically carbon nanotubes, and took a new filament, a new roll of PLA, and moved it through that organic solvent. So a very thin layer of the dissolved PLA with the carbon nanotubes got attached to the to the line he moved through it.
Huh.
Thanks to the fact that the PLA dissolve was already pre-polymerized and it was so large, it managed to drag with it a lot of the carbon nanotubes and got stuck to our new filament we moved through it.
That
After printing, you get whatever it is you printed still covered with those carbon nanotubes, only between layers, only around the actual line of the filament after it got heated up and stuck back together. And carbon nanotubes is nano, so you can play around a lot with its abilities and what it does. One of the interesting things he managed to do, he managed to make it so when you heat it with a certain microwave, it's actually going to create very strong, it's going to heat up and it's going to remelt the PLA around it. So basically, you printed whatever it is you printed,
right.
and then you make all the layers recombine again to
You
create
anneal.
a way sturdier product.
Yeah.
So
Basically anneal it with microwaves.
yeah, so by simply
That's
taking what
pretty
you printed
cool.
and putting it in a microwave, even not a very special one, it's quite I think he may even did it with the standard one and reported that also in one of the supplements. But in his best attempt, in the attempt he actually told us about, and what he managed to repeat the most, he made it about 3 times as strong. And in the articles, you can see him simply hanging from a small piece of PLA filament of something he printed.
That's mind-blowing to me because truthfully, I mean, even if you think about what PLA is made from, right, and it's plant-based bioplastic mostly. And the fact that it is as strong as it is, I mean, I know when I switched to my Voron, right, it was my first Core XY printer, and I was having crazy problems with skipping, right, because the printer would get caught on little bits of PLA, and it was never a problem when I was on my Prusa or kind of like a less acceleration, heavy printer. I guess
Mhm.
I don't want to say slower, but like on a printer that doesn't accelerate that fast, it was never an issue. And it was only happening with PLA. And I kind of reached out to the group, and they were like, "Yeah, PLA is really hard." And I was like, "It's never been hard for me to print before." And they're like, "No, no, it's like literally physically extremely hard of a material, way more than ABS, way more than P." So on the one hand, it's remarkable how strong PLA is, and yet I mean, Stefan has also shown just by annealing PLA, and for those who don't know, annealing is like you take your print, you put it in the oven, it recombines the layers, and maybe you can tell me. I think it crystallizes some of the bonds or something in the polymer. I don't know. It does something, and it makes the print much stronger. But this is even crazier because you could do it with a microwave, which means you don't lose the shape potentially of the print. So what
You
actually
still
is
need to print it with PLA, so you still get the same hardship from the beginning, but the final product is going to be about 3 times as strong
That's
and
remarkable.
3 times as hard to break.
That's remarkable. So wait, when we anneal PLA, is it just that we're improving the layer adhesion, or is something actually happening at the, in the bonds between the molecules? What's happening there that's making it 3 times stronger?
So by using this heating, by remelting it, even just a little bit, or making it close to melting, it gets a lot softer, and in the molecular level, you pretty much manage to break whatever mid-set it was on, because PLA are very long molecules that it's polymers, of course, so they're very long molecules that have many interactions between them, both because of the large amounts of carbons in them that create van der Waals interactions, and because of the dipole in them that manage to create some dipole-dipole interactions. By giving it energy again and letting it cool back down, you give it a chance again to find the minimum of energy it's going to get stuck to.
Uh-huh.
So by doing it a few times, usually you're going to have statistically a lot more option to reach this minimum energy, and this minimum energy is what the material wants to stay. We all know that the world, that thermodynamically, everything wants to be in the minimum energy and in the maximum chaos, but because we're looking at minimum energy, we're going to find the exact way it's going want to stick and to remain, and so it's going to be a lot harder in whatever energy you're going to put later on to destroy it or to change it.
Uh-huh. That went over my head. I'm going to be completely honest with you.
So I should probably lower a bit the scientific level that I'm trying to speak about.
But if anyone in the audience has a follow up to that, let me know. That one was that was over my head, but that's okay because a lot goes over my head. We got a lot of questions in the chat here. One person, Kobe, wanted us to elaborate on 4D printing prominency in the foreseen future. Thanks for the question, Kobe. That's a really good one.
So 4D printing.
Let's just define what 4D printing is. I saw a video that Michael Laws at Teaching Tech did about it, but I'll let you describe.
So 4D printing is basically anytime you 3D print something that you can that will have a memory of whatever shape you want, or that you can make it move to whatever shape you want.
Right.
For example, if I print a part that contains a hydrogel part using a resin printer,
right,
I can make it so once it reaches a certain humidity, something is going to expand inside it. Because it's going to expand, I can make a box open, for example. So I can get a box that I 3D printed and it contains whatever it is I chose, and once it reaches a certain humidity, it's going to open. If I play around with, instead of humidity, to play around with light, with whatever rays are going, whatever wavelengths are going to hit it. One incredible thing that I've seen from Bezalel, from School of Art, that did a collaboration here with the Hebrew University, created a ring that around the diamond, they printed what looks like a flower. But once it catches certain light, once you take it out into the broad daylight, they're going to open up because of how some of the parts are going to reduce in length or extend in length because of the light. And by that, it's simply a flower opening up, showing a diamond on your finger.
That's pretty wild. That is pretty wild.
If we're speaking about plants and things that we can do from them, you spoke about some of the things that we took from plants. Cellulose is the sugar that we see in almost most plants, and is very rigid, and we can play around with it in many sort of ways, and it's also completely recyclable. One interesting thing about it, once it gets degraded and in certain conditions that are specifically also about humidity, it gets deformed in a very specific and easy to predict way. So when people created filaments, where they knew exactly where and how the cellulose are going to be in the filament, they were able to start playing with how it's going to deform over time in the slicer by choosing what angles the different layers are going to be. So by simply playing around with that, they managed to print a lot of things that are like very long, small boxes that over time get deformed in different sort of ways, showing
That's
a
really
variety
interesting.
of options that you can simply, your print is destroyed, but in the exact way you wanted, and this is the 4D, the time dependency.
That's super interesting to me for a lot of reasons. One, I'm an aspiring green thumb, and anyone who watches my channel knows I love gardening, and I have you ever have you ever taken a step back and tried to like experience something from first principles, and you realize that this thing that we all take for granted is actually freaking insane? So I'll give you an example. Like I took an online course on masterclass from the Gangster Gardener, and it was about urban gardening. And I learned about all these things that like we all kind of know, like propagation, right? Like if I cut off a branch from a tree and I put a little bit of rooting hormone on it, ideally, but also if I just put it in water, I'll have a new tree. And you think you take a step back, at least I do. Maybe I'm the only one, but you take a step back and you're like, this is freaking alien shit. Like this is insane. It's
Mhm.
so crazy. Um and so I'm super fascinated by plants and greenery and agriculture, and I'm super fascinated in the interaction between what 3D printing can do, and also, you know, in situations where we've destroyed our ecosystem, like coral reefs, right? And needing to recreate entire ecosystems. Like imagine what we can do with 4D printing. So yeah. By the way, this is a good chance to take a moment and stop and thank today's sponsor, which I have to do. Sorry, I forgot to mention, and that is PCBWay. PCBWay is a fantastic, fantastic source for upgrading your own 3D prints, whether you need to add PCBs or you want to add metal to your prints. They offer everything from your own custom designed PCBs all the way up to ordering other people's ready-made designs. You can also have them do sheet metal manufacturing. They can do injection molding for you. They can do metal 3D printing, CNC machining, anything really. So whatever it is you're trying to do for your next project, whether it's a 1-unit project or a 1,000-unit project that you want to commercialize, PCBWay is the way to go, and they will help you in just a few clicks upgrade your project to more commercial ready and just more polished. So thank you to the wonderful folks at PCBWay for sponsoring the episode. All right, Guy, I'm back. Sorry about that.
Wonderful.
Apparently,
I
apparently my mic.
remember that one of the craziest things that I've seen in the past few years that I forgot to speak about with how we flew to different topics. And that is one of the most interesting materials that are going to be that people are going to be able to print probably in the foreseen future with resin printers. And this is glass. You're
Yeah,
going to be able to print glass.
isn't that wild? Like, and you're not talking about a glass-like substance, right? You're talking about
No,
actual glass.
actual glass. The ways that you can create glass, there are a number of different ways, and sol gel, solidification, gelification, is one of the ways that are done specifically, usually specifically if we speak about nanomaterials and how we can play around with them and the ways that they
Right,
work. And in
right.
order to create them, you need to either create very acidic uh, environment around them or basic environment around them.
Hmm.
And we also know of materials and of molecules that break down when you light certain UV lights on them, which is
Right.
exactly what DLP and SLA printers do. So there are
Huh.
already researchers, specifically also here from the Hebrew University, from Professor Shlomo Magdasi's group, that have already done that. There are already 3D prints that are made from glass.
That's crazy. I thought in order to make glass, you needed a tremendously high heat. Or is it the case that you're using nanopolymers to create that high heat? It's reacting and creating heat, or is there another way to make glass that I'm not aware of?
There is another way. Even if you
Wow.
simply take sand and you heat it up very much, you use the heat to get rid of everything in the sand that you don't really want, and you use
Got it.
the silica oxide, for example, if you have some sort of quartz crystals inside them, and you play around with that to manage to make them into glass. But you can also create particles with the silica. You have a silica atom surrounded by whatever there is around them.
Right.
I'm not going to go into the very facts of the science about it and how it works. You can start creating a chain reaction where they are getting replaced by another of the same kind. So you
Wow.
manage to create a long line, or even you can connect them from all four ways or to some degree, and create glass. It's not the same way that you usually think about when I speak about with you about glass blowing and how to make things from glass, but it's still 3D printing glass.
Wow. And so essentially I could, with my resin printer, I could print all kinds of products, and then I could print the glass, inserts. Recently, well, it's not available to me now, but I used a laser cutter, right, to cut acrylic if I needed clear windows for a project. I could just print the windows ostensibly. Also, glass is really good in the body. I mean, they've been using for decades now glass for RFID chips to put in animals. So glass is really, really, the body doesn't, I mean, it's, as long as it's, clean when it goes in the body, we know that, it's surgically viable. That's fascinating. So a few more questions here. We have some from our audience. And by the way, if you are listening in the audience, we're coming up towards the kind of final fourth of the interview. So if you have questions, please submit them and I will add them to a list and you will get the opportunity to ask questions. Damon asks, who is a Patreon supporter, so thank you very much, Damon, for being a supporter. Do you think that one day we will see a filament without compromise? For example, something with the heat resistance of nylon, but also as strong and as easy to print as PLA? That's a great question. Thank you, Damon.
I honestly don't really know what's the actual answer for that is going to be, because each filament is going to have its own attributes and its own way of printing and way of creating and price range.
Right.
So maybe there will one day be a new filament that you will find to be your favorite filament. Maybe it's going to be one of the newer one that I didn't get a chance to speak about because I didn't want to go into the specificity of polymer science. But I think we'll just live and get to know it.
That's awesome. Do you think that there will be a filament, though, in the future from what you've seen with the polymer science? I mean, I think at the root of Damon's question, he's asking a question that we all want to know, which is like, PLA is incredibly easy to work with because it melts at such a low temperature and it loves cooling, right? Those are the kind of like two characteristics of it from a non-polymer scientist. It doesn't mind if there's drafts, and it loves low temperatures, and it loves lots of airflow. Do you think that a filament can be made that is as easy to print as PLA, but has that high heat resistance? Because, and I guess maybe a different way to ask this is, can there be a filament that prints at a low temperature, but after it's printed has a high temperature resistance? Or is PLA easy to print because it prints at a low temperature?
So you're asking if you can find a filament that melts in a low enough temperature for easy printing, but
Right.
also doesn't melt in a low temperature, so it's resistant when you try to heat it up back again. You
Yeah,
can
like
speak about
maybe.
the same attribute twice.
Sorry, what? I missed the second part of that.
The temperature you need to soften something enough to move it, which we call either transition glass or melting
Right.
temperature, depending on what you mean when you speak about softening it and changing its properties, is something that is an exact point for
Right.
each polymer, despite being able to play around with it a lot. For example, I can play
Right.
around with how long the chain of PLA is, or I can add some additives to PLA, or I
Right.
can change something small about the PLA, like creating what we call a copolymer,
Yep.
taking lactic acid molecules, but every once in a while you have another molecule inside of the chain, or you have like block copolymers, so you have a bit of PLA, and from here to here the chain continues and it's something completely different. The most known copolymer for us 3D printer is ABS, which are
Right.
three different monomers creating one polymer.
Right. I'm wondering, is it theoretically possible to have a plastic that the first time you print it behaves one way, and then after it's reached that certain point, the characteristics change? Maybe something in it is destroyed to where, because the dream, I think, to the core of what Jax just said in the comment, like, is it possible that I could print it at 190, and then after it's hit that, or 200, let's say, after it's hit that 200-degree temperature, something changes in it to the point where it now has a higher, I guess not, right? Because it would have to, once it hit that 200, I mean, if it melts at 200 once, it's always going to melt at 200. Or is it possible to change something in it once it reaches a certain temperature? Kind of how, once a magnet hits 200 degrees, something happens in it and it's no longer magnetized.
Okay, the magnets are so different, and metals are
Right.
so different from organic polymers in the way we
Right.
speak about them. So this example doesn't really give me much to work and to play with.
Yeah, I got you.
But why are we even speaking about reheating things we printed back to 200 degrees?
I'm just curious if it would be possible to make a filament that prints at a low temperature but is very heat resistant. And I guess the answer is not really.
Yeah, let's stay with not really, but again, there are so many researchers that I'm not aware of, and there are
Sure.
so many things that change every day about it.
Okay, let me
We
give
don't
you a
really have
softball question. Softball question. Of all the companies, and I know you've been, only researching for 2 years, and I know you probably don't want to pick favorites, but of all the wonderful companies making filament out there, and you've probably experimented with a lot of them, which one of them do you think is doing the most innovative work in their compounds and their polymer science? You can name a few, but who do you think, whose product have you used either personally or in the lab where you go, okay, these guys know what they're doing, they make a really nice polymer?
So because of the fact that I'm doing modification to the filament, I didn't really see all that difference because I didn't really look for all the difference between the different companies. And because every time that I modify a polymer, I need such a small amount to do my research that I
Right.
think that in the 1 year since I moved from DLP to FDM, I think that I still didn't finish 2 spools for research purposes. I actually
That's
think
funny.
it's just about 1 spool that for research purposes because I can, by modifying 2 meters even of the filament, I can create so many small samples. And a lot of
Right.
time, let's say I work with the bacteria for my antibacterial tests. Bacteria are already small. I need just to print a small disc, like 3 millimeter with diameter and 3 millimeter height, and it's enough for me to play around with and to check. So I didn't
Got
use
it.
all that much.
Got it. Well, the planet thanks you, I suppose. Let me ask this then. Are you doing any, has all your research gotten you into the hobby, or is it like you get home from the lab and you're like, okay, I don't really want to 3D print anymore?
So it's definitely what got me into the hobby. For me, 3D
Cool.
printing was far from being love at first sight. It was a lot more of a, the more I got to understand it, I fell in love with it more and more. So my first project, my first real big project was using DLP, and we don't have a DLP printer in the lab. I had to go to the printing center of the Hebrew University to rent the DLP for the day and to send each time again and again my samples so I can spend an entire day there to get all the samples that I need. So I'm speaking about an entire day that I send each time a printer takes like 20 minutes or even less. Wait for it to print so I can send it again. During the time, I just had to sit in a room with so many interesting printers. With I'm speaking about inkjet, and I'm speaking about FDM, and I'm speaking about SLA, and I'm speaking so many interesting things.
Yeah.
I got and I got to experience it then, and only once I was about done with the DLP project that is submitted to be published. It hasn't been published yet because I wanted us to change a few things before we actually publish it. So when I was done with that, I wanted to move on to another printer to see what I can do with that, and because there are so much more to do with other printers, and I wanted to check out and play with FDMs.
Right.
And once I got it, and once I built the kit, and once I start working with it and playing around with it, and started watching videos as I'm playing around with it, I got to fall in love with it more and more. So
That's
now I
cool.
have behind me one Prusa printer, a Prusa Mini that I won in a competition, in a 3D printing competition, just a few days
Nice.
ago. And its first print was this morning, was a Banshee that is in front of me that I just printed this morning. And
I
I
was
also
gonna
got a
ask, what
printer
was the
for my
last thing you
home.
3D printed? So it was a Benchy?
Yeah, it's a Banshee because this printer was literally only contacted to electricity 12 hours ago.
Okay. All right. Cool. I'll take it. That's really cool, and congratulations on the Prusa Mini. That's pretty awesome. So we have some good questions here. David Williams wants to know, what do you think of Prusa's new tungsten PETG?
So I didn't know they created the new tungsten PETG, and I do not know what they actually added, how they actually added it, but they probably also added it as an additive before the twin extruder. I think they used as to in order to extrude the filaments.
Right.
Tungsten is a metal that is very much known for the fact that it expands very little when it's heated to a large degree, and it remains
Right.
very much exact in the same way. So just from guessing from the name alone, I believe they did it so it's going to live longer when you try to heat it up over and over again when it's exposed to light for a long time or to heat. But
Right. I think I'd
this
read
is
that it
simply
was.
guessing from the name.
Yeah. I think it was. I'd read that it's for radiation protection purposes.
Oh yeah, tungsten is also great for that.
Right. So in situations where there's going to be X-rays or things like that, I had the opportunity to play around, and I probably shouldn't talk about it, but a super secret tungsten filament recently that I can't really talk about, but it was horrible to print. So I'm assuming this is going to be much easier to print because I wasn't successful printing this stuff.
I'll actually need to research about it also because some of the things that I print when it's not for my research, it's for laboratory usage. So
Uh-huh.
maybe I'm going to need it to print certain parts in the future.
That's cool. Noam Tzvi asked a wonderful question, and I'm going to modify the question as I ask it, which is, do you think it's going to be a slicer, or do you think it's going to be in the CAD software where we can actually predict the results of the 4D printing, right? So if I design something, as you said, and there's a very predictable way that the cellulose is going to break down, how do you envision that working? I mean, is that something that goes into Onshape, or is that something that the slicer knows?
It's going to be more of a slicer because
Really?
the way that it's going to deform, we can make it so that the cellulose or whatever molecules that we're trying to play with is going to align in a very certain way in the filament, and the way that it's going to deform over time will be very much dependent on how you lay down the filament, which is what you do in the slicer. You
True.
can decide if you want it to switch 90 degrees every time you print a new layer, or if you want to be it in another angle, or if you don't want it to switch at all. I printed so many things that are the layers just go like this, just to
Yeah.
check a few different parameters about it, that I already know a bit about how you can play with it, and I believe this is where we're going to see the major
That's
use,
really
and it's going to
interesting.
be used
And
for
it
everything.
underscores why it's so important that slicers be open source. Because I think, let's be honest, right? Prusa, who makes the slicer that many of us use, is probably not going to be the person to modify and adapt that, right? Because they probably don't have biochemists working at Prusa, and they shouldn't. And probably the same is true for Ultimaker and Cura. But there is going to be someone out there who's going to be in your field, or who's going to be a biochemist, or who's going to be a marine biologist, and is going to look at the software and go, I need it to do something that is not commercially viable for a company to do. And they're going to modify it in the same way that Soft Fever has modified the bamboo slicer and made it what he wanted it to be, or she wanted it to be, who knows, and come out with Orca Slicer. So I think it's really interesting that we can see, I mean, that we can foresee a future where someone goes, yeah, I want to make a version of Prusa Slicer that actually calculates the degradation rate of cellulose based on how it's sliced, and they can write that code because it's all open source. It's super important that slicers be open source, because otherwise someone who wanted to do that would need to start from scratch and write their own slicer, which would stop it from happening. No marine biologist is going to rewrite a slicer from scratch. Probably. They'd have to be one hell of a marine biologist.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. Jax McIntosh has a wonderful question. Most exciting thing that you've printed and favorite non-work print?
So as I said, I've started using FDM about a year ago in the lab, and in my home it's only been there a few months. And the most exciting thing I've printed, that I also am the one who created a model, are holders for lab tubes, but for singular lab tubes that I modified to look very, very nice. And those are going to be the gift for the visitors in my friend's wedding next week. So I printed in bulk, I printed like 200 stands, and I also bought the tubes, and I'm buying the flowers. And my gift for them for the wedding is the flowers that everyone is going to take home in a lovely holder that I 3D
That's
printed.
cool. I was gonna, until you said the flowers, I was like, so you're gonna give lab tubes as a wedding gift? But then I got it with the flower. That's very cool. Like an individual flower in water. I like to ask guests, Guy, what are you most excited about right now in the industry that's coming down the pike? And it doesn't even have to be in your own research. But what are you most excited about in the world of 3D printing right now?
Well, the year is so young, and like 3 times this year already, I was amazed by things coming up. Whether it was the Bamboo Lab, the Slicer 2.6 from Prusa, or those arc ability to create overhangs that Stefan spoke about. I think that what Stefan spoke about, those arcs, and especially in the newest videos he did about them, of how they can already be implemented to our usage, and so to make them available so people play around with them. I think this is so exciting, and I think they look so beautiful.
Yeah. Very, very cool. Guy, I want to thank you so much for your time. I don't know, I mean, you're obviously doing research, but how can we in the audience support you? Is there a Twitter you'd like people to follow, or is there somewhere you'd like people to check out your research? How can we be of service to you?
Well, I don't really publish my research on a daily basis. I only publish it on my LinkedIn every time I actually release something. In fact, even my last poster, I forgot to post there, and it took me a few days to remember to post the thing that I printed for the competition where I want my Osamini at. But yeah, probably the LinkedIn is the best place to actually see things that I do, but don't expect to see all that much.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. Awesome. Guy, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who tuned in live. Again, I want to thank our good friends over at PCBWay for sponsoring the podcast. And this has been Guy Naim. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Guy, have a good evening.
Good evening to you too.